History is written in the sound of swords, in the words of kings, and in the pandemics that have reshaped the world. The plague, smallpox, Spanish flu, they are familiar ghosts, leaving their mark in graves and groans. But in the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a very different plague arose. A plague that was not spread by breath or blood. It was spread by sight, by despair. A plague that was not recorded by coughs or sores. It was recorded by footfalls. This is the story of a time when hundreds of people danced to death. To understand this madness, we must understand the world that spawned it. Strasbourg in the early 16th century was not a happy place. It was a city under the rule of the Holy Roman Empire, a place where life was extremely fragile. For years, famine raged. Fearful diseases like leprosy and syphilis lurked on every street corner. Superstition and fear of divine retribution crept into every household. The air was thick with anxiety, a powder keg of the collective psyche waiting to be ignited. And that spark came on a hot July day. A woman, known to history as Frau Trophia, Mrs. Trophia, stepped out of her little house and onto a cobblestone street. And then, without warning, without music, without reason, she began to dance. This was not a dance of joy. Witnesses described it as a disturbing sight. Her body jerked, her limbs flailing uncontrollably. Sweat poured down her face, but her eyes were blank, staring into the distance. She did not sing, she did not laugh. She just danced. Her husband begged her to stop. Neighbors gathered, first curious, then concerned. They tried to hold her back, but some supernatural force made her break free and continue her frenzied dance. She danced all day, until night fell and she collapsed from exhaustion. But hours later, at dawn, she got up and continued. 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. Her legs were bleeding. Her body was convulsing with fatigue. But she could not stop. The bizarre event quickly became the talk of the city. But then, the unthinkable happened. This madness, it turned out, was contagious. A week after Frau Trophia began her dance, a few neighbors joined her. Then a few more. They did not know each other, had no connection except that they breathed the same desperate air of Strasbourg. Like Trophia, they danced involuntarily, their bodies controlled by an invisible force. The city authorities and the most respected physicians were summoned. They observed the growing crowd, the writhing bodies in a never-ending dance. After consulting with ancient medical texts, they came up with a diagnosis that would turn a strange phenomenon into a deadly disaster. They concluded that this was not a supernatural curse, but a natural illness caused by hot blood. And according to the medicine of the time, the only cure for such an illness was to let it burn itself out. They decided that in order to cure these people, they would have to make them dance even more. In the history of medicine, there has rarely been a decision that was made with good intentions, but had such dire consequences. With a firm belief in their warm-blooded theory, the Strasbourg City Council did not try to stop the dance, but on the contrary, created all the conditions for it to flare up with the most ferocity. They turned a private madness into a public event. They cleared the grain market and other public spaces to make room for the patients to dance. They also ordered the construction of a giant wooden stage right in front of the bustling horse market. A stage not for plays or speeches, but for the plague. And to ensure that the therapy was effective, the city government did something even more incredible. They hired professional musicians. Trumpeters, drummers, and lute players were paid to play from morning till night. Their tunes were not meant to entertain, but to urge, to keep tired legs from resting, to push exhausted bodies further. Strasbourg had become a carnival of death, funded by the very people whose job it was to protect the population. The scene in the city in late July and early August 1518 must have resembled a Hieronymus Bosch painting. Hundreds of people, now estimated in number as many as 400, danced wildly in the streets and on wooden stages. They were no longer neighbors, no longer friends. They were a single mass of bodies, writhing in a collective spasm. Their faces showed no joy but agony. Sweat and tears mixed together. Their clothes were torn, and many had wrapped rags around their bleeding feet so they could continue. but they still danced. They danced while begging for mercy, while screaming the names of the gods, while staring into nothingness. The relentless music, the pounding drums, and the pounding of feet on the ground formed a symphony of hell. And this therapy had a predictable result. It did not cure. It killed. Under the scorching summer sun, bodies already weakened by hunger and disease could no longer withstand the constant exertion. People began to collapse. One man clutched his chest and collapsed, dead of a heart attack. Another woman convulsed and fell still, a stroke. Others simply died of exhaustion, their bodies having no energy left to sustain life. At the height of the epidemic, it was said that as many as 15 people died each day. Their bodies were hurriedly dragged out of the dancing crowd, while the music continued and the rest did not stop. The stage of healing had become a stage of death. At this point, the city council finally realized their terrible mistake. Their plan had failed miserably. They had not healed the people, they had killed them. Their confidence in rational medicine was shattered. They panicked, ordered a halt to all activities, dismantled the stage, and banned all forms of public dancing. They realized that medicine had failed. And when medicine failed, in the fearful world of the 16th century, there was only one place to turn: God or the devil. Explanations had now shifted from the natural to the supernatural. And so had cures. When reason fails to explain madness, people seek answers in ancient legends and deep-seated fears. The Strasbourg authorities, after failing miserably with their medical treatments, turned to an explanation they had initially tried to dismiss. This was not a disease of the body, but a curse of the soul. And in the treasure trove of European folklore at that time, there was a saint associated with uncontrollable dancing. That was Saint Vitus. Saint Vitus was a 4th century Sicilian martyr who, according to legend, had a special power to punish blasphemers by inflicting them with a hysterical dance, a never-ending spasm. For centuries, any illness associated with involuntary spasmodic movements was collectively known as the dance of Saint Vitus. Now, faced with hundreds of citizens dancing to death, the authorities and clergy of Strasbourg concluded that their city was suffering from the saint's punishment. The plague had been renamed. It was no longer a hot-blooded disease. It was the curse of Saint Vitus. And if the cause was supernatural, then the cure had to be spiritual as well. A new plan, completely opposite to the previous one, was put into action. The dancers were no longer patients. They were sinful pilgrims. Music was banned. The stage was removed. Instead, the dancers, still twitching and moving uncontrollably, were gathered together. They were tied to ox carts, forming the most bizarre and tragic procession in the history of the city. The group of death pilgrims headed out of Strasbourg towards the Vosges Mountains. Their destination was a small shrine, a cave carved into the side of a mountain in Saverne, dedicated to Saint Vitus. They believed that only by visiting the site and asking for the saint's forgiveness could the curse be lifted. Picture that journey. Dozens, maybe hundreds of people, their bodies still twitching, their limbs still flailing, piled onto ox carts and dragged through the countryside. To the peasants along the road, it must have been an apocalyptic scene, a procession of the possessed being taken away for exorcism. Upon reaching the temple, a series of religious ceremonies were performed. The dancers were brought before a wooden statue of Saint Vitus. Priests performed a ceremony, recited prayers, and sprinkled them with holy water. They were given small crosses to hold and red shoes to wear, a curious detail recorded in history, which may have had some symbolic meaning that we no longer understand today. They were asked to make small offerings and pray for the saint's forgiveness. And then, a miracle seemed to happen. Within weeks of the pilgrimage and the rituals, the dancing began to subside. One by one, the patients began to regain control of their bodies. The spasmodic movements slowed, then stopped. The plague, which had claimed dozens, even hundreds, of lives, was finally over. For the people of Strasbourg in 1518, the answer was clear. The curse of Saint Vitus had been broken through faith and repentance. The miracle had occurred. The story was recorded as a testament to the power of the divine. But for us in the 21st century, a different question arises. was taking the patients away from the stressful environment of the city, stopping the torturous music, and performing a ritual that gave them hope and a sense of control, the real medicine. Did a miracle happen? Or was it just one of history's most eloquent examples of the power of the mind over the body? The modern scientific explanation is perhaps even more bizarre than a divine curse. Modern science, looking back at the events of 1518, does not see a miracle. It sees a large-scale psychological crime scene. It does not see a divine curse. It sees a horrifying demonstration of one of the most mysterious and terrifying human phenomena, mass psychogenic illness, or more commonly known as mass hysteria. To understand this hypothesis, we must go back to the context, to the powder keg of despair in which the people of Strasbourg lived. Remember, it was a society driven to the wall. Prolonged starvation had left their bodies exhausted. Deadly diseases such as syphilis, smallpox, and leprosy were a daily reality. And above all, there was a deep spiritual fear. They lived in a world where they believed that demons were real, that curses could kill, and that God could inflict terrible punishments on them for their sins. They lived in a state of extreme psychological tension, a state of collective anxiety. In such an environment, all that was needed was a spark. And that spark was Frau Trophia. Her public, uncontrollable dancing became a catalyst. To her stressed-out neighbors, the sight was more than just a woman in trouble. It was a physical manifestation of the terror and helplessness they felt inside. The disease began to spread, not through bacteria or virus, but through an even more powerful mechanism, suggestion. A person sees Frau Trophia, and their underlying fear of being punished or losing control arises. Their mind, already in a state of extreme vulnerability, begins to ask, could this happen to me? And in some cases, the brain answers, yes. Their body begins to mimic the symptoms they have witnessed. It is not pretending. For them, the feeling of being controlled by an outside force is completely real. And this is where the city government's mistake turned a small spark into a conflagration. By recognizing the dance as a real phenomenon, building a stage, and hiring musicians, they legitimized the hysteria. They sent a powerful message to the entire population. This is a real disease, and it's happening. This created an amplifying loop. The more people believed in it, the more people got sick. So why did the pilgrimage to the temple of St. Vitus cure them? The mass hysteria hypothesis also explains this perfectly. First, it completely changed the environment. The patients were taken away from the city of Strasbourg, where all the stressors were. Second, it gave them a sense of control. Instead of being forced to dance pointlessly, they were now participating in a purposeful ritual, an act of penance for healing. And third, and most important, there was the power of the placebo effect on a large scale. The entire community believed that the rituals at the temple of St. Vitus would work. That strong belief, reinforced by the priests and the solemn rituals, sent a powerful message to the dancer's subconscious. The curse is about to end. You'll be healed. And the mind, in many cases, obeyed that command, gradually returning control to the body. This theory is compelling. It explains the beginning, spread, and end of the plague without any supernatural element. It shows that the human mind, under enough pressure, can become its own worst enemy. But is the whole story just in the mind? Or is there a real poison, an evil mold, that has sown the seeds of this madness in the very bread they eat every day? A seizure of the collective mind. An elegant and psychologically powerful explanation. But what if the mind was only the secondary victim? What if the real culprit was something tangible, a microscopic invader that had attacked the city's most basic source of life? Bread? When modern scientists turned to the case, they found the perfect physical suspect, a well-known culprit that had spread madness and death across Europe for centuries. Its name was ergot. Ergot is a mold, Claviceps purpurea, that commonly grows on rye and other cereals, especially in cool, damp weather, the very conditions that led to the Strasbourg famine that year. When harvested and ground into flour along with the rye, the fungus enters the food supply, and the toxin it produces, when consumed, causes a condition called ergotism. The disease has two main manifestations, both of which are equally horrifying. The first is gangrenous ergotism. Victims will feel an intense burning sensation in their limbs, as if fire were burning beneath their skin. A symptom so terrifying that it has been given its own name, St. Anthony's fire. Then gangrene sets in. Fingers, toes, and sometimes hands and feet turn black, shrivel up, and fall off the body. But it was the second form, convulsive ergotism, that caught the attention of researchers. Its symptoms bore a chilling resemblance to what happened in Strasbourg. Victims would suffer painful muscle spasms, uncontrollable convulsions, causing their bodies to jerk, twist, and writhe. And on top of that, they would experience extremely vivid and terrifying hallucinations. They would scream, talk to apparitions, and act completely insane. They would essentially appear to be dancing involuntarily. The connection was almost perfect. During a famine year, the people of Strasbourg would eat whatever bread they could get their hands on, even if it was made from rye contaminated with fungus. The poison would seep into their bodies, and the dance would begin. This also explains why the plague broke out in the summer, right after the grain harvest had been affected by wet weather. And here's the most shocking detail. The main active ingredient in ergot is lysergic acid, the same substance that chemist Albert Hofmann used to synthesize LSD in the 20th century. Essentially, hundreds of Strasbourg citizens were likely accidentally mass poisoned with one of the most powerful natural hallucinogens on Earth. They weren't just having seizures. They were having the worst mass trip in history, trapped in a chemically induced psychotic nightmare. This hypothesis, with the weight of biochemical evidence, seemed to settle things. It provided a physical cause for the most insane behavior. Yet it is not perfect. Why do the Strasbourg Chronicles, which are so detailed, only describe dancing? Why do they not mention other classic symptoms of ergot poisoning, such as the burning sensation of St. Anthony's fire or cases of gangrene? And more importantly, the pattern of the disease's spread doesn't seem to match. Food poisoning doesn't spread from person to person through eye contact. Why did it start with one person, then spread to a few, and only really explode into hundreds after the government encouraged it? We are faced with two strong suspects, two powerful explanations. One attacks the mind through fear and suggestion. The other attacks the body through toxins and food. Which is the real culprit? Or is the truth, once again, a horrifying combination of both? A poison in the bread and a fever in the mind. Two theories, both strong, both with flaws. Mass hysteria perfectly explains the spread, but poorly explains the intensity of the symptoms. Ergot poisoning perfectly explains the symptoms, but doesn't fit the pattern of spread. For years, historians and scientists have argued, each side defending its own culprit. But why one or the other? What if the tragedy in Strasbourg was not a case of a single perpetrator, but a perfect conspiracy of two killers? A brutal combination of physical and psychological. Consider this hybrid scenario, a perfect storm hypothesis. It all started with a physical cause, ergot, due to famine. The people of Strasbourg were forced to eat low-quality rye contaminated with ergot. Some, possibly including Frau Trafia and the first participants, consumed small amounts of this poison. Not enough to cause the horrifying gangrenous symptoms of St. Anthony's fire, but enough to cause mild convulsive symptoms, involuntary muscle spasms, restlessness, dizziness, and possibly mild hallucinations. They were physically ill. Now, put these physical symptoms into the psychological powder keg of Strasbourg. In a society that already believed in the curse of St. Vitus, neighbors who saw Frau Trafia and others twitching and acting strangely did not think it was food poisoning. They thought it was a sign of a curse, a divine punishment. This fear became the fuel for mass hysteria. The disease began to spread in two parallel directions. Some people continued to be poisoned by the contaminated bread. Others, physically healthy, began to exhibit the same symptoms through fear and suggestion. The two phenomena merged into one, becoming indistinguishable. A person convulsing from the poison stood next to a person dancing from hysteria. To an observer, They were one and the same. And when the authorities made the fatal mistake of encouraging dancing, they inadvertently created the perfect environment for both of these murderers to thrive. The music and chaos only added to the hysteria of those affected by the disorder, while the forced exertion of the body hastened the death of those who were actually poisoned, who were already weak. This hybrid hypothesis resolves the contradictions of the other two. It explains why the plague had obvious physical symptoms due to ergot, but spread like a psychological disease due to mass hysteria. It explains why no gangrene symptoms were recorded due to low doses of toxin. And it explains why the scale of the tragedy was so great. It was a positive feedback loop of horror. The toxin caused symptoms, the symptoms caused fear, and the fear caused more symptoms. The tragedy in Strasbourg, then, may not be an either/or mystery. It is an tragedy. It is ergot poisoning and mass hysteria. A deadly combination, a perfect storm like no other in history. The mystery of how it happened seems to have been solved, but a deeper question remains. Why was the expression of this hysteria dancing? Of the myriad ways in which the body and mind can break down, why an act so often associated with celebration and joy? Perhaps, to understand that, we must look at the very symbolism of dance in a world on the brink of change. Why dance? Of all the ways in which the collapse of mind and body can manifest, why an act so often associated with life, celebration, and community? Perhaps the answer lies not in medicine or toxicology, but in the mind of medieval Europeans. For them, dance was more than an act. It was a symbol of duality. On the one hand, dance is a form of divine ecstasy. In many religious traditions, including some branches of early Christianity, dancing to the point of exhaustion was seen as a way to draw closer to God, a way for the soul to escape the body and reach a state of ecstasy. It was an act of extreme faith. But on the other hand, and the more terrifying side, dancing is a sign of demonic possession. Choreomania, or frenzied dancing, is believed to be a punishment, a curse that can be inflicted by the devil or angry gods. The dance of Saint Vitus is the most famous example. In this case, dancing is not a choice, but a torture. The body no longer belongs to the person. It has become a puppet, controlled by a malevolent supernatural force, forced to dance until the heart stops beating. The people of Strasbourg in 1518 lived in a world where both possibilities were perfectly real in their minds. The dance could be either a prayer or a curse. Now, let's put this double meaning into our perfect storm hypothesis. Ergot caused the initial seizures, but it was this cultural background that shaped how those seizures were expressed and understood. The victims' minds, in their hallucinations and pain, struggled to find meaning, and they latched onto the most familiar image of loss of bodily control, the dance of the gods or the dance of the devil. The seizure was no longer a seizure. It became a dance. But there's a third layer of meaning, one that modern sociologists have introduced. Dance, in this case, may be a form of unconscious protest. Remember that the people of Strasbourg were living under unbearable pressure. They were oppressed by famine, by disease, by the lords and the church. They had no voice, no power. They were completely helpless. And when a person is pushed to the limit, sometimes the body speaks for itself in strange ways. The dance can be seen as a collective act of rebellion by oppressed bodies. It is a refusal to conform to all social norms. You cannot work, you cannot pray, you cannot follow orders when your body is dancing uncontrollably. It is a complete breakdown of order. It is a wordless scream, a feverish outburst of despair. In a world that has taken everything from them, dance is a way for their bodies, the last thing they have left, to assert their existence, albeit a self-destructive assertion. So the Strasbourg dance of 1518 was not a single act. It was the convergence of three currents: a physiological symptom caused by poison, shaped by a deep cultural belief in the sacred/demonic dance, and driven by an extreme social despair. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the dance stopped. After months of chaos, the last of the people had stopped dancing. The city fell into a weary silence, leaving behind graves and an indelible memory. but it left an echo, a chilling question about the thin line between faith and madness, between celebration and hell, and the strange ways the human body can tell the story of its suffering. And then silence. As suddenly and inexplicably as it had begun, around the beginning of September, the dance stopped. The last survivors gradually regained control of their bodies. The city of Strasbourg, after months of collective nightmare, finally woke up. They woke up to fresh graves, to broken families, and to a memory that no one really understood. This horrific event, along with several other smaller outbreaks in Europe, faded away. It did not become a major medical lesson. It did not spark a social revolution. Instead, it faded into history, becoming one of the most bizarre footnotes, an incredible tale recounted in books of folklore and strange phenomena. Why has a tragedy of such magnitude been largely forgotten by history? Perhaps because it was so absurd. It did not fit into the grand narratives of war, politics, or religion. It was a story of the collapse of reason, an event that exposed the terrifying fragility of the human mind and of the social order. And that is a truth that no age wants to face. But the story of the 1518 dance frenzy is more than just a historical anecdote. It is a timeless warning. It is a case study in how a perfect storm of factors, physiological, psychological, and social, can create a catastrophe. Think about it. A society under extreme economic and mental stress. A vague, pervasive fear of an invisible threat. An initial triggering event amplified by the attention of the crowd and the media of the time. The rumors, the preaching, and a collective belief strong enough to turn an idea into a physical reality. Sound familiar? The Strasbourg plague was a viral phenomenon in its purest form. It didn't need the internet or social media to spread. It needed only frightened eyes and brains. It was a testament to how, despite technological changes, the human psyche remains vulnerable to old patterns. Ultimately, it was not a devil or a god who made the people of Strasbourg dance. The real devil was created by a combination of despair, hunger, and fear. The real curse is the fragility of our own minds. The tragedy in Strasbourg shows that the line between sanity and madness, between order and chaos, is much thinner than we think. And under enough pressure, any society, any community can begin to dance its own dance. The dance in Strasbourg ended 500 years ago, but the question it posed still resonates today. When the music stops and reason collapses, can we be sure that we ourselves will not start dancing?